Hi, this is Brad Linder with Liliputing and the GPD Win Max mini gaming laptop, which as you can see is a system that comes with Windows 10 preloaded, but it's a full-fledged computer with an Intel Core i5 processor, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, and lots of ports for a little computer like this. So theoretically, you can plug in an external drive, a USB flash drive or a disk drive, and boot into a different operating system. Unfortunately, as of the time that I'm shooting this video on May 16th, 2020, the results are really not great when you try to do that. I tried Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Manjaro, a bunch of different operating systems, Elementary OS, and none of them really worked because of display issues. So not only was the screen rotated, so it thought it was in portrait mode instead of landscape, but there was also some duplication issues. People who are better at debugging those issues or running, custom kernels or other things might be able to get farther than I did, but for now, I would say that if you're interested in buying one of these laptops and you're not a developer, you should really think of Windows as the operating system it's going to run until people have more time to try to troubleshoot the other things. I will show you a little bit later in this video what happens when you try to boot into Fedora, which is an operating system that I had slightly more luck with than some others, but we'll get to that in a moment. But this is a video where I wanted to show some power user features. So I am going to show you what happens if you adjust some other settings, or how you can adjust some of those other settings. So out of the box, this is a system with an Intel Core i5 1035 G7 processor. That's an Ice Lake processor with Intel Iris Plus graphics. Intel's 10th generation chip normally runs at 15 watts in most laptops, but Intel allows laptop makers to configure it to run at up to 25 watts. Usually that's a decision that's made by the laptop makers, but in this case, you can actually adjust it yourself. So out of the box, you'll see right now the computer's not doing very much of anything. And so I've got HW monitor up here, and it's not using a lot of power. I'm going to run a little Prime 95 here, just to crank up the horsepower. And you can see now we're running at 20 watts. And you can hear that fan kick in. So this is with the default out of the box. It can hit up to 25 or 30 watts depending on what it's doing. And right now we're running sort of a CPU torture test. The CPU is likely to get hotter. CPU is running at 100%. You can see the speeds here. And of course it'll run down the battery pretty quickly at this rate. So that's with the default settings. But you can go into the system tools or the setup utility and change that. So let's go ahead and exit this, reboot, and I'll show you some of the settings. There are actually a lot of different configuration settings available. So once it reboots, I'm going to sort of hammer the delete key here. And that should take us to the setup utility, or BIOS or UEFI settings. It can be a little finicky, so there's no guarantee we're going to get this on our first try, but let's see what happens. There we go. Bring it a little closer so that hopefully you can see. So from the main screen, we see information. It's an Intel Ice Lake processor, 4 cores, 8 threads, and so on. From the boot menu, you can change the boot device priority. You can adjust quiet boot or fast boot and other settings. Security, I'll show you out of the box. Secure boot is disabled, so that's not necessarily a problem. Chipset settings and advanced. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of advanced settings. So if we go into CPU configurations here, you can see there's a lot of options there. Power and performance. Thermal configurations, etc. But power and performance is where I'm going to go right now, because this is one of the easiest things that you can do, and also one of the more interesting things you can do, which is we're going to scroll down to config TDP settings. And from this screen, you'll see sort of our current settings, but then the custom settings for nominal, down, and up. So out of the box, this ships with TDP configured up. And that means that it's got a power limit of 25 watts and a second power limit of 30 watts. And that those are the constraints within which the processor runs. But you can also set it to nominal, which is 15 watts with an upper limit of 25 watts, or down, which is 12 watts with an upper limit of 20 watts. And so what's going to happen here is at the up mode, you'll probably get the best performance for gaming or other really resource-intensive tasks. But if you really wanted to prioritize battery life, you could switch to the down or other settings. So let's go ahead and change this to, let's go all the way to the down option. Now, if you wanted to, you could also go into some other settings here and sort of set custom controls. You can set your sleep states, enable or disable these settings. Adjust the maximum or minimum frequencies for the GPU. And so on. But we're just gonna, for the most part, go in and have that TDP changed, and I did adjust the GPU speed to maximum because I'd actually set it down to 1100 previously. All right, so let's bring up hardware monitor again. And actually go back to our benchmarks. So you can see now we're running at 10 or 12. And if I let it sit for a moment, it'll probably calm down and go much lower than that. But if I run this, CPU usage is going to spike, and it's hitting 20 watts again, but it fairly quickly comes back down to 10 or 11 watts. And if we look at the frequencies, they're going much, much lower here than they were previously because we've set those power constraints. So under these conditions, you should get longer battery life, but probably slower performance. Now I'd have to let this run for a lot longer to really sort of... Actually, that is still running in the back because I forgot to hit stop, I think. Oh, no, I think it's slowed down. Okay. So if I let it run longer, you could really see over time what that does to performance. But the other thing that I wanted to do here was show you what happens when you try to boot from a USB flash drive. So I'm going to go ahead and plug one in here. And this time, when I power up the computer, I'm going to hammer the F7 key instead of the delete key. And that should bring us to the boot menu, or boot device priority menu. We'll say we want to boot from the flash drive, and the first thing you'll notice here is that the grub bootloader menu is sideways because it thinks that we're in portrait orientation rather than landscape. But I'll go ahead and say we want to boot into a live environment. And this will take a moment, but one thing that you'll notice pretty soon is that there seems to be a graphics issue here, where not only are we mirroring some of the stuff, so you actually see duplicated content on the top and the bottom, but you can also see that it's duplicated and overlapping, so that the text, even if I turn this sideways, is kind of hard to make out because it's overlapping. And that becomes much more clear once we get into the OS here. So I've actually got multiple cursors on the screen. If I try to bring up the display settings, you'll see that that alone doesn't necessarily resolve the issue. The keyboard works. The touchpad works. The problem is figuring out which icon is actually the one that you're trying to look at. Or trying to click on. No? Oh, actually, you know what the problem is? I need to click this way. And now, can I get the cursor over to the part that says portrait left and click and apply? Great. So now we're at the point where at least it's facing the right direction, but we still have these duplication problems. So it's a problem that I think needs to happen at the kernel level. It's probably a setting that it's going to be difficult to adjust from within the graphical user interface here. But again, people who know more about how to debug and troubleshoot Linux issues might be able to get farther than I have. But the out-of-the-box experience is pretty similar on different operating systems that I've tried. So Fedora, as I mentioned, I was at least able to get this far. But Ubuntu, Debian, Elementary OS, I've had a variety of different display-related issues with all of them. So overall, I would say that's about as far as I'm willing to test Linux for now, but in the future, maybe other people will be able to get a little bit further. Because it is a pretty interesting computer that is capable of doing a lot of things. It does have the full QWERTY keyboard. It does have the built-in game control buttons. It has an 8-inch 1280 by 800 pixel display, a relatively powerful GPU. It's a versatile machine that is pretty cool to use in a lot of different ways. I think it's really excels as a gaming machine, but because of the hardware, it's capable of doing much, much more. And if Windows isn't your thing, other operating systems might be viable in the future, but for now, I'd say that Windows is really sort of your best bet. But like I said, there are lots of power user settings. It's also something that you can open up if you wanted to replace the SSD that's built in. You can find pictures of that in the review that's going to be posted at liliputing.com. And or check out Twitter. I think I posted some pictures on Twitter for Liliputing News that show what happens when you take this off and you can access the SSD on the inside. So power users might be able to get a little bit more done here than your regular customer, but Linux is definitely going to be a little bit more challenging. Just because I got a minute or two left in this video, and because we do want to talk about power features, I'll point out that it does have Ethernet, which works great. It has Wi-Fi 6, which works pretty well as well, Bluetooth 5, micro SD card reader, a Thunderbolt port, and a USB Type-C port. You can charge via either port, but the Thunderbolt is going to allow you to connect peripherals like external graphics if you wanted something even more powerful than the Iris Plus graphics that comes with it. HDMI output works just fine. USB ports, you got two full-size ones. And on the side here is a switch that allows you to toggle between using the controllers for mouse input versus game controller input. So, and on the front, we've got the headphone jack, which honestly, I don't love the placement. I would kind of rather have it somewhere else, because if you're sitting with this on your lap and you've got the headphones sort of sticking out, it might jut into your lap, but it works. It works just fine. And it's a handy thing to have because the speakers are not super loud. I mean, they're loud enough, but they're not super loud. And if you really want great audio, plugging in headphones is a good way to do that. It does support Bluetooth, so you could probably use Bluetooth audio as well. You might have to deal with latency issues under those circumstances, though. So this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, taking a look at the GPD Win Max with some power user features, including customizable TDP, mixed bag performance with Linux, ports, versatility, upgrades, and the fact that the screen bends back 180 degrees, which I know is something that a lot of people ask about as well. And that comes in handy if you wanted to sort of hold it like a game console like this. If you have other questions, let us know in the comments. Check out liliputing.com or the Liliputing YouTube channel for more details.